My talk today is about curriculum, about knowledge, about what it means to know things. And in terms of teaching, executed skillfully, it looks really easy. And it's because teachers have hidden talents. Hidden in that often they can't explain why they're doing things very well. It just comes naturally. My job as a researcher is maybe to make explicit the tacit knowledge that teachers do have, and some of my publishing and writing is doing that. I'm going to start by exploring a teaser with you. What's the nature of knowledge? Is it like a ladder that you climb up rung by rung, that you can assess at each stage, and if you pass the exam you can go on to the next stage? Or is it like exploring a town, where you wander around, have a look at the buildings, go to the theatre, have a meal in a restaurant, just get the vibe of the town? Now, I'll leave that with you, and we're going to return at the end of my talk, maybe to explore that a little bit further. What I'm trying to get at in the next 45 minutes or so is what it means to be educated. And I'm going to tell you about a friend of mine, a chap I met about 18 months ago. His name's Martin, company director, playwright, author, assistant head teacher, and yet he considered himself as a school failure. Through hard work, determination, he became an advanced schools teacher, and reflecting on his own experience at school, he observes, "I was not the sort of rebel who would burn down the school. I was far subtler than that. I started a school newspaper. I set up a debating society. And I was trying to set up a branch of the National Union of School Students. In lessons, I would ask questions and challenge what was being taught." Now, he was not traditionally academic. He did get a bunch of O-levels, didn't stay on in the sixth form. He worked as a salesman, and at the age of 23, decided to take a degree as a mature student. Then he worked again selling advertising space, and in his mid-20s, he took a PGCE and then taught for 20 years in tough London schools and was described as outstanding by a series of Ofsted inspections. Now, to me, that begs the question, what is it to be a well-educated person? Now, a few hundred years ago, say in pre-industrial society in England, the vast majority of people could not read and write. Typically, men, women and children worked in the fields or in cottage industries. Workers were predominantly unskilled, though there was an important place for skilled artisans. The crafts they learned was often through apprenticeships. Now, to receive an education then, one was either upper class or in the church. So either one had a private tutor or probably attended a seminary. And so to be educated, one would speak French, or in the case of priests, Latin, and have knowledge of philosophy and the classics. During the industrial era in the United Kingdom, education provision expanded rapidly due to changing social and political needs. Population grew from 7 million in 1751 to 26 million in 1871. And the Reform Act of 1862 enfranchised 1 million people. This involved academic provision at infant and elementary schools and technical vocation training, which was usually done by voluntary associations. And now, to the present day, we demand a good education for all. The debate now is what knowledge and skills young people should possess, what should be in the national curriculum, what should be taught, what should be assessed. In Finland, for example, there is a social and political consensus as to what should be taught, and it's left up to teachers how to go about teaching that. There's a 10-year cycle of review. It's not political, Every 10 years, stakeholders come together and they do a refresh of the curriculum. Teachers are highly involved in that process and they're highly respected. Teachers are well paid and drawn from the brightest of students, and they must possess master's degrees to be teachers. In England and Wales, education has been the so-called political football. Teachers appear to be easy targets. Incoming ministers of education often say that they will increase standards by decree, and while I'm not qualified to talk about other UK jurisdictions beyond England and Wales and Jersey, maybe that's something we can come back to in the discussion. And you've had elections recently, so my plea to the New Jersey, the new Minister for Education in Jersey is: don't change too much, but support your teachers. There's a polarised debate in England, Wales, the States, Australia and certain parts of Europe between those who advocate a specific curriculum that should be delivered by teachers and those who advocate a more student-centred approach, and words like skills for the 21st century are used. So traditionalists, if you like, or the educational right, they want to protect the status quo, and respect for authority, and progressives, or if you like, the education left, talk about attitudes, talk about dispositions to knowledge, talk about the skills necessary, for example, to design things. That implies a different curriculum, a very different pedagogy, and a fundamentally different notion of learning, where the learner is fully agentive in what they do. So my argument in this talk is that education actually is pretty complicated, and I believe the apparent tension between core knowledge that must be learnt or the process of learning things is actually a false dichotomy, and I'll be returning to that later. There is, of course, a world of difference between classrooms and teaching and learning. And it appears to be a cultural norm to envisage teaching spaces for 20 to 30 people and a teacher in front of the classroom talking with learners sat passively. And here are some examples. The demise of the traditional classroom has actually long been foretold. So we had the advent of radio broadcasting, and I'm old enough to remember Skippy the kangaroo in Australia, and that was meant to be, if you can broadcast the lessons, why do you need teachers anymore? More recent examples are TV broadcasts in the 1970s and 80s. So again, if the experts are there delivering their message, why do we need teachers anymore? Now we talk about the internet and e-learning, and I've even read about the demise of universities due to MOOCs. And yet the traditional classroom is incredibly resilient. And if you have a look at the last slide there, the people have iPads, but they're still in rows in a very traditional setting. So I think it's pertinent to ask some deeper questions. What is it to be educated, and what role for schooling in the education of young citizens? These are not new questions. They've been asked by every generation, and sometimes with different answers. I'm now going to share with you a well-known plea from an American head teacher and Holocaust survivor. And he writes, this is to his own staff in his school in I think it's New York. I am the survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no man should witness. Gas chambers built by learned engineers. Children poisoned by educated physicians. Infants killed by trained nurses. Women and children shot and burned by high school and college graduates. So I'm suspicious of education. My request is, help your students to become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, arithmetic are important, but only if they serve to make our children more human. Now, in its narrow formal sense, a curriculum may be akin to syllabus. But most educationalists see it in a much more broader sense and argue that a curriculum embodies a philosophy education, a justification of what it is and what it tries to achieve. The curriculum may be construed as a plan or a process, or again as to what is taught or what is learnt. So what should be in the school curriculum? In addition to the academic subjects, I have heard suggested that schools should teach personal finance, healthy eating, drug awareness, warn children against internet grooming. There's a danger that the curriculum gets too congested and we get bogged down in the minutiae with a list of things that teachers must cover. I suggest if students actually get a broad and balanced curriculum, they'll know their own gaps, and with the internet and with children being able to research for themselves, they can fine-tune their own education where it's needed. This is more possible than ever in this digital day and age. Richard Pring, in his book The Life and Death of Secondary Education for All, discusses the current discourse of deliverology. The reaction of the education right to perceived failure of schools is to run them more like businesses, and in so doing to shift the language of education to that of management theory. Pring tells the story of a successful businessman who tells an audience of teachers, if I ran my business the way you people operate your schools, I wouldn't be in business very long. He goes on to say that the success of his blueberry ice cream company is the meticulous way he chooses the best blueberries and rejects those that are just not up to his high standards. And a teacher answers back, that's right, and we never send back our blueberries. We take them rich, poor, gifted, talented, exceptional, bruised, frightened. We take them all, every one. And that is why this is not a business, it's a school. And the analogy of education as a business does disturb me. If we as a society buy into school as a business, and with the high stakes of Ofsted inspections and published league tables, with heightened media scrutiny on schools, schools will start to game the system. Admissions will be subverted, with the schools that can taking only the juiciest blueberries, and the motivated ones with parental support, who will excel in exams. And then there is the pressure to cheat to help students get higher grades. So coursework in GCSE has to go then. And sadly we're there already. Coursework has been scrapped at GCSE and the English and Welsh system. It is pertinent to ask if education is a means in itself or a means to an end. Is the teacher a deliverer of the curriculum, the content decided by some education department, or a curriculum maker, in other words, developing subject knowledge in a context appropriate for his or her students? So what I'm really saying is knowledge an entity to be learnt, or is it a vehicle to understand the world? I'm now going to read you a short extract from an Ofsted report written in 2011. It's the business education report, but it's written generically. The standard approach adopted in most of the lessons observed was to set out the learning objectives, explain a theory or concept, and then get students to apply their understanding to a case study or other exercise. However, in some of the outstanding lessons seen, teachers applied more imaginative approaches by starting lessons with a piece of stimulus material, such as a headline from a newspaper or a video clip. This immediately grabbed the attention of students, particularly when it was based around something that was very current, which students could easily relate to. Skillful questioning. Through skillful questioning, teachers explored the issues raised by the stimulus and started to develop the concepts that underpinned it. Students were encouraged to ask questions about the material. For example, what else might be needed to know in order to gain a deeper understanding? Using this approach meant that it was often a little way into the lesson before the learning objectives were identified by a teacher. But this had the advantage of making them more meaningful and relevant to students. Hooray Ofsted! I strongly recommend that teachers actually listen to what inspectors do say and not the myths that abound. I'm about halfway through the talk and we're going to have a little intermezzo. What I've got here are 5 pictures, and what I'd like you to do is to talk to your partner, so pairs or threes. Can you tell me what's the news and does it have any relevance to schooling or education? So there's kind of 5 bits of news, please. Right, are we ready to go? Who'd like to start us off with what are the stories that you think are relevance? Who'll start us off with the top left? Lovely.
Hi, Fiona from Highlands. Top left, movement of people in Europe.
Is there an educational story that could be?
Oh yeah, there's lots of articles we could use in English, or I'm sure you could use some maths, population, the whole ethics of immigration and refugees. And
So we've got a lot about, certainly in England, UKIP and stopping people coming in from Europe. What's going on? What are the facts? Bottom left-hand corner. What's the story? Is it relevant to schooling or education?
Hi. Well, I've just been teaching Blake this afternoon. So this is about, I think, the banning of cigarette products now in shops and things. So we were talking about anti-authoritarianism and people telling you what you can and can't do. You need to make free choices.
I think that's Hong Kong, which is particularly relevant to me because my wife's in China. So, I don't know, it's relevant to the teachers, so maybe it's relevant to the students. It should be relevant to the students.
So maybe a discussion about democracy.
Top right is the Ebola virus, and teaching biology, I could bring that in to teach them about spreading of infections.
I assume that's oil tanks and the rising price of oil, and then perhaps as geography year 13 students we look at globalisation and conflict and the price of oil affecting conflicting situations, and I'm sure that can be brought into maths if you're looking at line graphs, etc., etc.
I think what I'm getting at here is these are all happening recently in the news and a good way to switch on students to make our teaching more relevant. Teaching Teaching at its best is a dynamic, highly skilled, I'll move the slide on, highly skilled, creative task which involves utilising a whole range of different types of knowledge and expertise. The knowledge that teachers need is multifaceted, and a teacher needs a deep understanding of several different knowledge bases together with acquired professional expertise. These include subject knowledge, general pedagogic knowledge, curriculum knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, knowledge of learners and their characteristics, knowledge of educational contexts, and knowledge of educational ends. For me, as a regular classroom observer, the expert blend of deep subject knowledge with appropriate pedagogy is particularly satisfying to observe. What we ask of our teachers is not easy. We expect our students to know things and pass exams. We expect our students to be equipped with the skills and understanding to cope in a complex world. We expect our students to be enthusiastic and motivated to learn at school and to like and thrive in school. So back to learning. Do we want our students to study hard subjects or soft modern ones? Do we want our young people to know key dates and events from history, or to be able to use the internet to find out anything they want to know? Do we want them to be good at working in teams and have the patience to listen to other people's opinions, or to know by heart the capital cities of European countries? And of course, these are false dichotomies. The tensions I'm referring to are not new. From ancient Greek and Roman times, there was disagreements between traditionalists who favoured the status quo and progressives who asked difficult questions and sought change. The famous trial of Socrates, arguably one of the founders of modern thinking, illustrates the point. Socrates, the ultimate progressive, was found guilty of corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens and subsequently sentenced to death by being forced to drink hemlock, a poison. So not much has changed, except these days the state may not get away with bumping off its more vocal dissenters. In my job as a university lecturer, I have the privilege of extensive travel and seeing countries and education systems firsthand. Two of the best performing countries are South Korea and Finland. When I was in Finland, I observed bright, intelligent, committed teachers who were knowledgeable and passionate about their subjects, teaching very traditionally, but teaching very well. They used a lot of questioning and really forced the young people to think and answer questions. I was surprised at how little technology there was there, but also at how safe Finland appeared to be. So bicycles were left unlocked, and at lunchtime, teachers and pupils just left their bags and went off to lunch in the knowledge that they'll still be there when they got back. In South Korea, I found teachers to be highly intelligent, but a little nerdy and introverted. Lots of technology, and parents really pressurised teachers to do well. In fact, most children went to crammers in the evening, and it was expected that they'd do well in exams or there'd be trouble. Can we learn from Finland and Korea? Yes, we can. Teachers are drawn from the most successful graduates and are highly paid and respected, and education is valued by society. Let's have more of this here. Highly qualified teachers, preferably to master's level and well paid. We also, however, need to make sure that we learn from these highly effective jurisdictions in ways which are relevant to our own contexts, and we learn from what they are doing at present, not what they did in the past. So in Singapore, for instance, since 2009, they've moved to a more flexible and diverse system with greater student choice and more emphasis on skills and students' character development. Teachers are expected to focus on developing students' understanding and critical thinking. Exams have been reviewed to reduce the reliance on rote learning and to encourage independent learning and experimentation. These changes reflect a desire to make sure that the Singaporean education system equips a new generation of Singaporeans with the skills that they need to meet the challenges of the future. I like their slogan, teach less, learn more. I do like Mick Waters' analysis of elements that help children to thrive in school. I think they go a long way to answering my question of what it is to be educated. Waters defines 5 vital signs, and if students have some or most of these, the chances are they'll do well at school and thrive. The first he calls articulacy, literacy and numeracy. For without these 2 elements of competence, children won't be able to attack the curriculum. Literacy and numeracy competence allows children to express themselves and thus engage with deep learning. The second is a wide general knowledge. By knowing things, children will have the confidence to engage in friendships. General knowledge developed through experience, reading, conversations, curiosity. Thirdly, wide friendships. Children who do well often have lots of friends and they are popular. Easy friendships help children thrive. Fourthly, getting on with teachers. This is not sucking up to teachers. It's rather what we call emotional intelligence. Knowing when to be silent, knowing when to answer questions or to ask questions. And it's those subtle clues that help us get on in life. And finally, making a contribution to school, like be playing football or netball or rugby or singing in the choir or being involved in the school play. Children who contribute, Waters argues, are more likely to do well. I agree with all those 5 elements, but I think there's something missing. And the missing thing is the school subject. I think the best teachers have passion for their own subjects, and it is infectious. Students intrinsically love to learn, and they'll have their own favourite subjects. And why not? I return to my question at the start of my talk. Is knowledge like a ladder that can be climbed rung by rung, or is it like a town that can be explored? And both conceptualisations have their merits. The ladder version has the advantage that assessment is relatively straightforward. We can test a specific bit of knowledge, and if the learner passes, he can move to the next stage. The town version is much more fun. You can explore, you can find out, you can go down the alleyways you want to do, you can go and see a play, or see some music, or go and eat some food, and find out what the town is good at. But do we want to assess that sort of knowledge? Perhaps just talking, being enthusiastic about the learning is enough. The rich and powerful in our society know how to bring up their children to ensure that they enjoy success. Qualifications are important, but they're not enough. Young adults need to know things, but they also have to have the confidence in themselves to be able to network and to be able to discuss matters of culture, travel, and high art. In the best schools, in the most successful jurisdictions around the world, young people are taught to understand the world around them in its complexity, including how it has been shaped by history, art, literature, and science. They also learn how to ask questions about the world around them in a way which helps them both to gain a better understanding of how things are and gain an insight into how things might develop in the future. The current drive in England to force our children into a narrow, one-size-fits-all traditional academic curriculum may for some do more harm than good and alienate them from school and deprive them of a good education. To conclude, I argue that an educated person in this day and age is well qualified, literate, numerate, good at questioning and being self-reliant, and someone who is enterprising, innovative and adaptable. And I do like the way the Singaporeans have expressed this. The language is gender specific, so on behalf of Singapore, I apologise for their sexism, but this is how it reads. The person who is schooled in the Singaporean education system embodies the desired outcomes of education. He has a good sense of self-awareness, a sound moral compass, and the necessary skills and knowledge to take on challenges of the future. He is responsible to his family, community, and nation. He appreciates the beauty of the world around him, possesses a healthy mind and body, and has a zest for life. In sum, he is a confident person who has a strong sense of right and wrong, is adaptable and resilient, knows himself, is discerning in judgments, thinks independently and critically, and communicates effectively. Self-directed learner who takes responsibility for his own learning, who questions, reflects, and perseveres in the pursuit of learning. An active contributor who is able to work effectively in teams, exercises initiative, takes calculated risks, is innovative and strives for excellence. And a concerned citizen who is rooted to Singapore, has a strong civic consciousness, is informed and takes an active role in bettering the life of others around him. Thank you for listening. So let's start the discussion.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Brant. I know that Grandma Willis would have had lots of questions for you, written on post-it notes. She can't be with us today, so I'm going to ask on her behalf. We have a relatively newly appointed Director of Education in Jersey, and we have a soon-to-be appointed new Minister of Education. And I wonder, in your extensive travels, where you would recommend this dynamic duo went first to learn what the most they could about improving an education system.
My two favourites are probably, my four favourites: Finland, Hong Kong, Singapore. I'll leave it at three.
Okay. And first? In that order?
It's a close one between Hong Kong and Finland. Finland's curriculum is actually very brief. They actually don't tell much for teachers. It's basically a kind of a broad brush approach. Hong Kong's and Singapore's are very specific and very directed. But what the three jurisdictions share is a commitment to education. So they draw the best teachers and they support those teachers. So they encourage the teachers. In Finland now it's mandatory to have a master's degree, but in the other two jurisdictions they encourage the teachers to continually develop themselves, educate themselves. What I do like about the Far East is the idea of moving towards an inquiry-based system of learning. So the content isn't just given and is no longer rote learned, because that's the tradition of the Far East, of rote learning a lot of material, but that children start to think for themselves and ask questions. So that's the direction of travel that they're moving. And ironically, I've had quite a lot of South Koreans over at the Institute of Education learning how to be creative and learning student-centred approaches to teaching and learning. And ironically, I say ironically because we're moving the other way with a much more traditional curriculum and assessments and less space for students to express themselves.
Yeah, that's my experience as well. Both approaches feel they have a lot to learn from each other. Yeah, absolutely. My second question is a more specific one, but again it's Jersey-centric. And it's about, you talked about the sharing of data, and you talked about the possible dangers and the effects of creating league tables and when data is published. In Jersey, it's something we're coming to terms with. It's something that is a current issue. How we publish and share school data in a constructive way. And I wonder if you had any observations on how we could do that in the best way possible.
John Locke, his famous adage was praise in public and blame in private, or words to that effect. And there are unintended consequences of being too open. So it seems a great idea to share for parents to know the most successful schools. But often what happens is something different. So the schools then choose their parents, or the schools choose the children through interviewing the parents, not the other way around. If there's an oversubscribed school, suddenly everyone wants to go there. And so you get these virtuous circles and vicious circles. And I actually think league tables have done more harm than good. So there's a gaming of the system, and head teachers and senior leadership teams become obsessed with results and the position in league tables rather than supporting the learning of the children. They're not necessarily 100% overlapping.
Thank you very much. Right, well, at this stage then, I'd like to open it to other questions. First time.
You mentioned the Singapore school system as a system you're in favour of. But from my knowledge of Singapore, most things in Singapore are angled at Singapore, at keeping corporate Singapore competitive, keeping the country of Singapore as one of the business leaders of Asia and the world. And so the school system is more or less a feeder into that corporate world. And you add that also to an interesting study by Credit Suisse, which looked at education systems around the world and which was failing, which were being very competitive. And they pulled out that educators think that they are producing children which are suitable for industry, etc., etc. I'm just choosing industry. I know there's more to education. But industry actually said that most people coming out of education were completely unsuitable for their needs. So it's interesting you put on the Singapore model, which seems to be very aligned with industry and seems to be one which you favour. But earlier in your discussion, you mentioned sort of your dislike of business being involved in the education process. How do those two things fit together?
So let me clarify that. I'm very in favour of business being involved in the education process and school and business links. And I think there's this is something that should be encouraged and developed further. But what I'm saying is schools aren't businesses. And running schools as if they are is actually a mistake. So I think the raison d'etre of schools is the education of pupils, all pupils, not just the brightest. And we don't want to disregard poor learners. There's actually a horrible consequence of ignoring the weaker students. Those that leave school are much more likely to turn to crime. So statistics indicate that children that are permanently excluded from schools, a large proportion of them go to prison. So we should keep all the children within the system and develop them. Now there are certain my background is economics and business, so as an educator, I actually develop those links and take student teachers to factories and so on to learn about business and how they can actually promote business. Now, there's a separate question entirely, and that is, what is the purpose of education? And is it industry fodder, in other words, to supply the needs of the economy, or is it to develop people's potentials? So if they love history, you encourage them to study history. History is not necessarily a subject that is very business friendly, and yet good history graduates tend to get very good jobs, and it's history graduates actually earn a lot better than the average of graduates. So a lot will find, will go into business, accountancy and other professions. So education is actually very complicated, and there are actually there's lots of things going on. But please continue.
But I think there's always this sort of, to go to an extreme when you suggest that a school should be run as a business, that because you're running as a business, therefore you neglect the less able students. Yes. But I think that misunderstands business. I mean, business, you have a market, you have needs which you address. Those needs can be the needs of the bright students. Yes. Those needs can be the needs of the less able students. It doesn't mean because you're running it as a business that you're neglecting a certain certain section of needs. And I think that's always the sort of the argument which is given, because if we run it as a business, therefore we neglect the less able. No.
It doesn't.
I don't think that necessarily is true.
You're right, it doesn't follow, but I think schools should be run professionally, and that's, but not for profit. There is a tension certainly in education, with a move towards academies and private businesses taking over state schools. Now, I'm all in favour of private schools. I think parents should have a choice. But when there's business interference in the running of state schools, and which might mean that less able students are excluded because of things like league tables, we're in a dangerous situation. This is my worry. So, yes, schools should be run professionally. Yes, I believe in school business links. But going back to league tables, published league tables may persuade schools, it's happening in the London area, to exclude more children. This is actually good for society. That's my worry. But I don't think we're in disagreement.
Having heard what you've been saying, and I entirely understand where you're coming from, how do you think that, given that we all need improvement in everything one does, and all organisations need improvement, how do you actually judge the output of a school?
It depends why you want to judge the output of a school.
In order to, because we always need improvement the whole time.
So, how it could be done is by observing teaching and learning. That's one way, and reporting on that, and that's done through various forms of inspection. So, Ofsted is the most public. We publish reports. We used to have a system of local authority inspectors coming in, and this was not reported, but teachers that needed improvement would be given additional help to develop them and so on. The other way is through the output of the schools, which is examinations. The league tables are the transparent manifestation of that, where how children pass key stage 3 GCSEs and A levels is published, and they can be tabulated. What I'm suggesting is that there are unintended consequences of that if they're public and transparent. So I'm normally in favour of transparency, but actually what's happened in the last 10 years is there's been a lot of gaming of the system, and children who might be grade D, E boundary, they'll be given worse teachers in bigger classes, and children that have an opportunity of getting a grade C will be pushed hard to achieve that, so the schools appear to be doing better and appear to be more successful. So what I'm saying is, actually, there's a lot of. I think your question's a very good one, and that's what we should actually look at, how we judge schools, rather than one narrow measure, which is kind of over scrutinised, which leads to unintended consequences.
At the beginning of the talk, you used the idea of seeing education as either a ladder to climb or a town to explore. I think that our current education system resembles the ladder more closely than the town. Do you think it's become necessary to change the system to become more like a town? And if so, how do you think we should do that?
This is something that won't happen, but scrapping league tables would go a long way to doing that. So a focus on learning is the most important element of that. So a joy for learning and learning for learning's sake. And paradoxically, children will do better because something goes wrong between primary school and secondary school. In primary school, there's a joy of learning, and that disappears in secondary school. I think there's an overemphasis on high-stakes examinations. But actually being able to learn freely and explore and do projects, students will probably do better than actually being forced to learn in a way that they might not enjoy. What children are very good at doing is satisficing, doing enough to please the teachers and the parents, so they'll do that. And was it Mark Twain who said he didn't let school get in the way of a good education? So you do a lot of learning outside of formal schooling. And I think schools that see that, and it's often the independent schools that provide sports facilities, put plays on, do cultural events and so on, are really good in that they're actually developing aspects of learning that are not formally assessed, but are really worthwhile doing, and that's part of a good education. I think a rounded individual who enjoys history for history's sake, for instance, wandering around and there's a museum, I'll pop in and have a look. That's great. Whereas if you over-formalise... So imagine the exploring a town analogy, and then you're tested. What was the high street called, and what's the population? It takes the joy of the learning and having fun. So I think, yes, I think the single most important thing to do would be to forget league tables and compilation of examination results and focus on learning rather than teaching. Good question.
Good afternoon. I'm looking at a career in teaching, and I had the pleasure about a year ago of a lifelong friend of mine saying, will you take my son's business studies GCSE into your hands, and felt this great sense of responsibility and really enjoying the process. But in my preparation for teaching him, I got the exam boards confused, but it's been a very interesting journey for me. The first one was I went for OCR, and I was wrong, it was at Excel, but in going through OCR, I found that the creativity and holistic knowledge about the world from a business perspective was enormously different from the factual kind of pure knowledge of just taking in different situations on a kind of factual level for the young man. So wondered whether schools were reacting to the success level of knowing there's a benchmark. If they have this knowledge in Excel, we'll get the grades we need, which is related to that young lady's question and your answer in terms of league tables. I felt quite concerned about this because in preparing a good businessman, I felt OCR was a much better journey for him. But just like to take your view on that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I just know I've seen a lot of business studies teaching, and there are some teachers that are obsessed. They teach the marketing, that's done. They'll teach the accounts, that's done. They'll teach HR, that's done. But how do they relate? So in terms of looking at a business, there might be a question, how might interest rates affect? And there might be a whole range of different effects for different sorts of businesses. And so actually understanding it from a business perspective is the important one. So to answer, there might be an HR element, there might be, and so on and so on. So I think in this particular case, you've done the right thing in looking at the boards and having a view of which you'd rather teach. And an approach of kind of understanding business and making decisions is a better one than kind of rote learning bits about marketing, bits about human resources, and so on. Are you going to become a teacher? Is that that's great. There's
I'm an MBA student, so I'm clearly finished an MBA, so I'm very well placed in your knowledge of the masters.
I think teaching is great fun, and I found it hugely rewarding. And just on a personal note, I had the kind biography read out. I've just completed 4 years in senior leadership at the Institute of Education, where my only students were doctoral students, and I decided consciously to go, and I now run a PGCE in economics, and I'm just loving it, just working with students who are committed and want to learn and want to teach. It's fantastic.
You're the man to ask, I won't keep you long. Do you believe fundamental traditional economic models, which are failing, which is why the world's in the situation it is now, are still being taught by business schools? How can we help basic secondary schools to move to something more sustainable?
So at the end of August, I delivered a keynote lecture in Aix-en-Provence in the south of France. And the title of the lecture was What's Wrong with School Economics and How Teachers Can Make It Right. So if you give me your email address later, I'll send it to you. And just bear with me 1 second. This was my plain reading on the way over. Economics, the User's Guide. Han Yung Chang is a fantastic book, and it's arguing for a pluralism in economics. So, yes, neoclassical economics is something to say, but it's not the only economics. And my argument in the paper is we should learn economic history and the history of economic thought as part of a broad economics curriculum. And we use neoclassical models, but also critique them, so understand the limitations of them. So there's a long way to go, but the new specifications for A-level for teaching from September 2005 are actually much better and allow a critique of models which didn't exist before. But I'll send you some stuff if you want to talk to me later.
I'm going to go to Principal Howard to allow him to come back on the student critique of his school.
Thank you, head teacher. Professor Brant, I'm really interested and taken by your philosophy for what makes a good education system. But isn't it all pie in the sky? It's very different to what is UK education policy. The Labour Party have said that they're going to continue with the coalition policies if they come to power. So aren't you guilty of being the archetypal academic shouting out in the wilderness? And why do you think that your learning is not having an impact on national policy?
What you say is fair enough. In December, I've been asked to speak at the Westminster Forum to a group of members of Parliament, which will include a view on GCSE reforms. I'm still to kind of write my response, but hopefully that will have an influence on policy. I think we are over-obsessed in England and probably UK jurisdictions with high-stakes summative assessment. So we actually need less assessment. Assessment is incredibly important, but there's just too much of it, and it's at the expense of learning. Finland does very little high-stakes summative assessment. Most of it, the teachers do formative assessment. Now actually, it's not all doom and gloom. There's some very good teaching and learning in our schools, and it's improved. I think we're in a better position than 10 years ago.